Croeso, this is James, aka JP Harker, coming to you with another video. This video we're looking at a book versus film. And the book, I know it's a massive print version but I quite like it, is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. And here's the film. It's the 1952 one, which I sort of grew up on. It's the Robert Taylor one, which I very much like. And I'm not going to hold these up throughout the whole thing because that's kind of silly. So I'm going to I'll just cradle them here and you can appreciate what of it you can see. Now, this book is about 200 years old now, and it does read that way. The story, it's the reason that we've got the Robin Hood myths that we've got now, is it's poached from this. Because the story follows Wilfred of Ivanhoe, who has come home from the Crusades, and good King Richard is missing from the kingdom, and evil Prince John is plotting against us, and it's down to the good and just, but not necessarily within the law, hero to save the good common folk from the tyranny of John. Now we all know that as the Robin Hood story, and there's a degree of originality in having that as Robin Hood, but the Robin Hood, Robin of Barnesdale, the myth that no one's quite sure how old it is, whether it's actually from this time period or whether it's from much later in the time of Edward III, that's a story for another day. But our modern concept of the Robin Hood story, of being a nobleman who's representing good King Richard, that largely comes from Ivanhoe. It's been poached here, even though Robin Hood is in Ivanhoe as a sort of supporting character. He's just known as Locksley in this. That's sort of the context of it. He's this noble knight coming home, look how terrible things are, I'm going to fix them, and good King Richard will fix them all. There's a reason I keep saying that with a degree of irony. Richard I was not a good man by any distant stretch of the imagination. He was a terrible, terrible person. I seriously doubt if he could have spoken English. He might have understood a little bit of it. Spent 6 months of his reign actually in England, spent most of it in France and in the Holy Land, and all of it taxing England to within an inch of its life to pay for his various campaigns and for his ransom. So, you may have guessed, it's one of my little pet peeves when people talk up Richard I. Awful, awful man. Even Sean Connery can't make that man good. But I digress. That's the concept of the story, and in the book version, we have Wilfred of Ivanhoe coming back, and Richard has come back in secret. I'd say spoiler alert, it's 200 years old. I'm not going to bother, careful with the spoilers. It is that old. There's no excuse. Richard has already come back, but he's back in secret, and there's this terrible conflict between Norman and Saxon. It's been 100 years or so, near 200 years since the conquest, and there's still this antagonistic relationship between the old guard of the Saxon nobility who are dying out and the Saxon peasantry compared to the aristocratic Normans. And Walter Scott, in a little bit of showing off how clever he is, does some of the old, you can still see it in our language today, boys and girls, because the rich people eat bœuf, which is French, and beef, and the poor people eat chicken because we just call the meat and the animal the same thing. And he does a fair bit of that, but I allow it because I'm kind of interested. And so it's not just a book about wicked Prince John and good King Richard, it's also a book about two different cultural groups and their clash. It's also, fascinatingly for its time, a book about anti-Semitism, because as anyone who knows this period of history even vaguely would know, it's a completely Christianized Europe, southern Spain notwithstanding. And it means Jews are not treated well, they are viewed as the absolute bottom of the pile of society. They are there to be used for their money lending, that's what they're there for. And 200 years ago, anti-Semitism was not particularly considered a bad thing in Western society. Terrible thing to say, but it's true. Back then it was largely a tolerated attitude. So to see it written here, where they have an almost ironically stereotypical greedy Jewish character who's actually got a much better nature and is explaining why this stereotype has come about. He's tight with his money because people keep robbing him, because Christians have free rein to rob from the Jews, so that's what's leading to this stereotype of him being greedy. But also, the most admirable character in the book is his daughter Rebecca, who is incredibly selfless, incredibly virtuous, not in too lectury a way, but in the way that she behaves and even in the way that she thinks. And that's interesting for its time. That's a very interesting, not just humanizing, but making the most virtuous character in an almost completely Christian cast Jewish. I thought that's there in the film, but it's not nearly as prominent as it is in the book, and I thought that was very nicely done. Now, as I say, I'm comparing it to the film. Now, this film changes an awful lot, but in my opinion changes a lot of it for the better. Because one of the problems with the plot of the book is Ivanhoe himself isn't there for a big chunk of it. He gets injured at the start and only really reappears at the end. And the middle bit is this mysterious Black Knight who turns out to be Richard. In this, they borrow even more Robin Hood type stuff to weave into it, and they make it about paying Richard's ransom, which is the plot of the Errol Flynn Robin Hood film, which was, I think, 20 years before this, maybe 15 years before this. So that part's a big departure from the book, but not a bad departure, because it means our hero is involved all the way through. We're more invested in the Ivanhoe of this than we are in the Ivanhoe of this. Something they've done, and I think they did fairly well, was with our villain, Bois Guilbert. Because Bois Guilbert is a quite sympathetic villain, even though he does some terrible, terrible things. Because he's not evil for its own sake. He's not that greedy, and he has some amount of virtue, even though it's sort of buried deep down. And unfortunately in the book he does an awful lot of talking about that, and an awful lot of thinking about that, and an awful lot of moralizing and justifying about that. Whereas in the film, yes, he's a villain, but you see it more in his actions, and you don't need the amount of dialogue to explain where he's coming from. So I thought that was good. That was something that they adapted very well. I wasn't as keen in this on Wicked Prince John and Good King Richard, but then that's in this as well, just in a different context, because we have that hero worship of Richard, which, and looking in context, while this was being written by Sir Walter Scott, we had a lot of anti-French feeling going on in Britain at the time. We were at war with France, as we habitually are. And so there's a lot of anti-French, anti-Norman propaganda in this, and at the time there was this romanticising of the pre-Norman, more Germanic England, so there's a bit of propaganda for that as well. So that's another one of these you have to look into in context. But yeah, I've rambled a bit because I like different things about the two different mediums, and they're not necessarily contrasting or one doing it better than the other one. It's just they're different, and different not in a bad or a good way. So when comparing them, it's almost as if you can't compare them, because while they're similar, they are so different it's not really fair to compare them, because they're done in such different ways. I'm going to round this off fairly simply with, I would recommend reading this, I would. But I would probably recommend either watching this, or if you want to watch the Sam Neill version, fine. But watching this because this gives a lovely outline of the characters and gets you invested in Ivanhoe. I suspect if you tried reading this without having seen something like this first, you would fall into the trap of not really caring about the hero, getting impatient with all the chatter that Bois Guilbert and to an extent Rebecca do, and not really becoming invested. So it's rare that I will recommend this, but I will in this case say, film before book. You will appreciate the book better having seen the film, and it's normally the reverse. But that's going to be my parting thought for this one. So, Ivanhoe, starring Robert Taylor, and, just to be fair, Elizabeth Taylor, Joan Fontaine, George Sanders and Emlyn Williams, which is 1952. Watch this film, it's very, very good. If you can ignore the archery in this is awful. And then the book, Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott, where the archery is actually quite good, but you don't see it, obviously. So I'm leaving it there. This is the first book and film comparison that I've done, so hopefully it's made some degree of sense, and it's made you have a think about what you want to have a go with. Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. James, aka J.P. Harker. Well,